Last week we spoke about wandering through the desert as we're segregated from our church and our community. This week we're going to be talking about the journey that the church has laid out for us in the readings in this Lenten season, so that we know who Jesus is and why he came to us. Becoming a deacon, I learned about something that I never knew, that the readings were laid out in a cycle. And that cycle runs from cycle A to cycle B to cycle C. Those three cycles represent three of the gospel writers: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. John is usually interspersed in those readings in each one of the different years. And why they use those three evangelists is because they each have a different viewpoint. And those three evangelists are called the synoptic writers. And what they do is viewed together is what synoptic means in the Greek. This year we're in cycle A with Matthew. And this year, though, is a little bit different. We're not reading straight through Matthew during our Lenten season, but we have Matthew for a little while, and then we jump to Luke for a couple weeks, and then we're into John. And why we're doing this is to see that revelation of Christ. So we started on Ash Wednesday, and on Ash Wednesday we read through Matthew, and Matthew was writing about Jesus, telling us not to pray and fast for others to see us, but to do it in our heart. Be clean-shaven, be washed, and not to do it for show. Really, that's what we're supposed to be doing all the time, is to do it so that we can internalize what God is telling us and bring God into us. And so we can really recognize who Jesus is. Mass itself is about God and his revelation through his only Son, Jesus. The very first week of Lent, first week is from Luke. And in this reading, we hear about Jesus being tempted by the devil. He's out in this desert wandering, and the devil takes him and offers him some wonderful things, so it would seem. You know, throw yourself down here and let the angels catch you, or, turn these stones into bread. But what we really find out about Jesus is that he has the power over the devil, because at the end of the reading he says, "Get away, Satan," and Satan leaves. That's really the very first revelation, is that he's the Christ and he has the power to shoo away the devil and throw him away. The second Sunday of Lent, we heard again from Luke, and in this reading he was speaking with Moses and Elijah up on the mountain, and he was transfigured into this glorious figure. He was radiant, he was white. And in this reading, we hear that the voice of God comes down, and he says that Jesus is his beloved Son, to whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. There is no better endorsement from that. But what the early readers of this gospel also recognized is that the two people that Jesus was speaking to, Elijah and Moses, both had a similar experience with God, that God spoke to them on the mountaintop. God spoke to them in a hidden meaning. So now we're equating that Jesus is extraordinary because these two gentlemen were extraordinary in their human life. But then they hear that God coming from the mountain says, "Listen to him. I'm well pleased." In the third Sunday, we do jump to John, and we find out that Jesus is the one from God. We find this in this exchange where Jesus is talking to the woman at the well. Now, this woman is a Samaritan woman. She is not Jewish at all. And yet he's talking to her. And she starts to believe, because of what Jesus is telling her about her life, that he's the Messiah. She actually becomes one of the very first evangelists, because she goes running back into town and tells all her friends and all her family that you got to hear this man and what he's told me. He's told me about myself. He's told me about things that I don't know, or nobody else would know. And so she brings him into town, and Jesus stays with the town for 2 days, and the town recognizes him too. And what's important about this is that they aren't Jews, and they are Gentiles, which means that Jesus came not for just the Jewish people, but Jesus came also for the Gentiles. Something different in the history of the Old Testament, because it was always Jewish-centric, where they were the chosen people. Now when Jesus comes, he opens up this glorious life and heaven to all that come to him. She recognized him as the promised Messiah, and we need to do the same thing. Last week we talked about John healing the blind man. And again, There was a lot of controversy in this reading, but we found out that Jesus had the power to heal. He healed this man of his blindness. And the purpose of the man's blindness was not because of sin of anybody else, but because God revealed his works through Christ in this man. It was also kind of unsettling, because it was at that point that the authorities started to grumble about Jesus and wonder who he was and what they were going to do. This week we have a completely different set of readings, and I want to talk about each one of them. The very first reading is from Ezekiel, and this reading was really in a setting where the Jewish people were being held captive in Babylon. They were exiled from their own homeland. They were taken away. They were abused. They were slaves. And somewhere in there, we hear that God's going to bring them free. Metaphorically speaking, what it says is that they're going to be freed from their graves. And they're going to be freed, meaning they're going to be freed from captivity. God is working in them and releasing them. In our second reading, we have a letter from Paul, and Paul's talking about life in the Spirit. But what he's talking about when he talks about the flesh is he's talking about those that do not know God, or those that may have even rejected God. He contrasts that to people in the Spirit, people that have accepted God and found God in their life through the sacrifice of Christ, the second person in the Trinity. Paul came and saying, you have life in the Spirit for those that accept Christ. And then finally, once more, we find Jesus, and he's going, and he gets called because one of his best friends, Lazarus, is sick and dying. But Jesus does something really unusual. He waits several days before coming to see Lazarus. He was only about 2 miles away in Bethany, but yet he waited a couple of days. As he comes into town, his friend Mary, Lazarus' sister, greets him and says, "Jesus, where were you? If you were here, my brother wouldn't have died." But Martha, Mary's sister, sees him and says, "Jesus, I know that you are the one from God, and that whatever you ask of the Father, he will give to you." Well, Jesus goes out, and you can tell that Jesus was really close to Lazarus, because as people are wailing and crying and really upset, and as Jesus is coming into town, he sees all this drama going on, and he too is heartfelt, and he too weeps over his friend Lazarus. But what he does, which is really amazing, is he calls on the Father and he says, "Father, you know everything." And he says this so that everybody can come into this realm that he's creating here. And he says, "Father, I know that you will hear me, and that I ask of you to give Lazarus to rise." And so he calls out to the dead man who's been in the tomb for 4 days, and he says, "Lazarus, come out." And Lazarus comes out of this tomb, and he's alive. That's amazing. And that's really something that we got to think about, because that's really a promise to us, that Jesus is able to rise us from the dead. Jesus is able to pull us into his life. Kind of like what Paul says, those who believe will be given this eternal life. And because of this miracle, this is where the Jewish leaders decide that they're going to kill Jesus, which we'll be talking about next week. But what we're called to do, is we're called to have the same faith that Martha did, to know that Jesus, and through Jesus, we too can have life in the Spirit.